right? So it's
Sure.
my pleasure to invite today to the UN Brief venture capitalist, investor in social impact companies as well, with a long history in Silicon Valley. Bill Tai, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to speak with the UN Brief.
Pleasure to be here, Maya. Really looking forward to this.
Yes, I'd like to start by talking about your career. You know, you have more than 30 years investing in companies. You invested in more than 150 companies, which 22 of which went public, actually. And
Yes.
you are now very interested also in working with companies that are adapting and adopting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Can you tell us a little bit about your history as an investor?
Sure. Yeah. So I got into sort of the technology field at a relatively young age in the actually 70s, 80s. I was kind of a hacker building things. I had seen a schematic, meaning the electrical drawing of a circuit that Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs had built, which was it's referred to as a blue box, which is a little tiny tone generator that plays a tone into a payphone, and it's the frequency at which the different telephone computers talk to each other. So it unlocks a system and you can make free phone calls. And so somehow when I was 12, my dad had given me a Radio Shack electronic projects kit. I found that schematic. I rode around on my bicycle playing with the phone system. That led me to becoming a computer chip designer. I was educated as an electrical engineer at University of Illinois. And when Apple and Intel were still really young companies, I moved out to Silicon Valley in 1984 to join a startup that was led by the CEO of Fairchild. And after that company became a success, I went on to get my MBA at Harvard, and I immediately came back to Silicon Valley. And I had a wonderful job in that era in the 80s. I was running around looking for little companies that might get big, and I would take them public. And then that led me to becoming an investor. In 1991, I switched over to venture capital, and I started in Silicon, funding chip companies, then moved up the stack to the communications equipment, and then to networks, and then the user interface, so a bunch of apps, then data science, and now I'm working on sustainability across those areas.
Yes, you speak about waves of technology, right? Like you
Yes.
have hardware, and then systems on top, software, and then other layers. And now you see another wave coming that we're entering into. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That framework is a wonderful framework because, I think there's so many interesting technologies that come out of Silicon Valley, but it's not easy to kind of put a framework around why it happened and when it happened and what's going to happen next. And to me, it's been, very simple. I think the Silicon Valley area really, with its name, Silicon Valley, got started around putting things on pieces of silicon that were basically a way to direct electrons. The world used to function on vacuum tubes, things that looked like little light bulbs to make computer systems. And they were big, they were heavy, they burned a lot of power, they got hot. Once you could put it on something the size of your fingernail, it made everything lower friction. So think about two things, lower friction and waves that build on each other. And so the silicon wave was very straightforward. Companies like Intel, AMD, National were able to take that architecture and make a lot of functionality available on things that look like Legos. Once that was available, people could take those Legos and build all kinds of things. So whether it was computer systems or communication systems, it unlocked another massive wave of value that expressed itself in companies like Apple or Cisco or any Dell computer or any of these things made out of hardware. And once you had those components, you could basically put those in bunches in big buildings and build data centers that ran the internet and the phone companies. So you took what was the phone system and analog phone calls and sort of chopped it up into little bits, again, lowering the friction to the movement not of electrons this time, but of ones and zeros and bits that form everything, the web pages and information. And so phone companies then became digital versus analog. And that was a giant wave of producing all the data center companies and the modern telcos that we have today. Once that existed, then you had the explosion of things that could express themselves on that mass. So if you think about what's a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter or any of these companies, they're really just ones and zeros coming off the screen. And it's the way the ones and zeros look and the way you interact with those ones and zeros that creates value. So you had an enormous, enormous wave of value around the companies I just mentioned, the Facebooks, the LinkedIns, the Twitters, the Amazons, the way you live. And that wave produced an opportunity for what I'd call a sort of a data science wave. So the companies that won each of those segments were the ones that really understood what was happening to those bits, the ones that really understood how to optimize engagement and make sure customers use the product. They understood the data science and could measure things. And that wave has now abstracted itself from just digital companies to the physical world. If you think about what is an Uber, Uber is basically a data science cloud with cars on the end of it. Airbnb is a data science cloud with rooms on the end of it. Companies in retail like Walmart and Amazon were very good at representing any physical good with a piece of data so that once you purchased it, it moved out of the point of sale terminal and the cloud was liquid and it would be very efficient compared to old retailers that just bought piles of inventory, hope they sold at Christmas. So I think we're in a world now where everything is optimized by its data representation in a network that makes the business more efficient. And so all of that leads to this wave of sustainability. So I think we're in this world now where, because of all those prior waves of technology and the really low friction applicability and usage of those, we're now in a position where you can take technology and make the usage of things far more efficient in a way that is less destructive to our environment and produces less waste. And it's not just that, it's also the application of that to the invention of newer things, whether it's in healthcare or medicine or things that make life better at lower cost and with less waste. And I think that's timed also with a number of sort of non-pure tech technologies like the energy industry, where the cost of fossil fuel has dipped in this recessionary period now, but the curve for solar and wind and other forms of energy production that are renewable and natural has just gotten better and better and better and better and more competitive. It's taken 10 or 15 years, but we're now at a point where all of these things there's a confluence of alternative energy makes sense. The technology is cheap and low friction because it's at scale. And you can combine those into wonderful new possibilities like, you look at the companies today like Tesla or Beyond Meat. They have supernova market values relative to their sales because the world recognizes that it is important for our future, for companies like that represent sustainability to exist.
Yeah, I see that there is this shift in the venture capital world where social impact startups are given more attention, because for the first time we are realizing, and this has been perhaps accelerated by the pandemic, that we are not isolated. We live in one planet, and what happens in one place will impact the other. So that became quite tangible, so to speak. And I think there is now this shift towards venture capital, looking for things that, that the social impact is not an afterthought. It's not just good corporate citizenship, but it's also necessary in order for the business to thrive. Why do you see then, why do you see that there's importance of, the United Nations has an investment fund now. It's supporting companies in different parts of the globe, away from Silicon Valley, away from the main centers. What do you see is the way forward, and how do you see your involvement in that aspect of venture capital?
Yeah, so I think, there's really three touch points there. First, the UN, with what has developed into a wonderful framework around the Sustainable Development Goals, gives every company and every person on this planet a way to attach to the 17 sustainable, any one of the 17 sustainable development goals that they care about, to at the margin change their behavior or their corporate ethos or their mission to tune towards something good for this planet. It's a wonderful just flag, a calling card, a way to drive a movement around each of those. So with that master sort of structure, what Lisa Kurbiel is doing with the UN Joint SDG Fund, really amazing. I think the UN is in a particularly unique position to, one, carry the message forward, but also to foster engagement and involvement at a government level to produce the umbrella and the sort of the environment and ecosystem to allow companies to flourish that have that mission and can tie to those goals. And I think individually, under all of that, the big picture and the government and corporations, I think for me, it's very clear. We're at a point now where commercial interest and sustainability are intertwined. As you were saying, Maya, if you're any brand in this world today, and you have a brand that does not stand for good and particularly stands for bad, this next generation will not buy your products. And so you have to have both a message and an authentic core for your company that is actually doing something good, and that gets the consumer interested in aligning with you. And so I think today we're at this intersection of venture capital being able to now steer its dollars because it matters. And unless you're funding things like that, if you're funding things that are not good for this planet, it's going to be hard to make money. So I think it's a natural alignment now of commerce meets good. And so, the common phrase of, do well by doing good, it's becoming a core ethos now.
And tell us about your investments in Zoom, for instance, which is a great platform that has seen an exponential growth during this time, and it has been quite, wonderful. I like what they did also because in the very beginning there were concerns about safety and privacy and so on, but they addressed it very quickly. They showed corporate corporate responsibility, responsiveness, right? Right away, they said, we're going to fix it. We're looking into it. They took it very seriously. They didn't engage into a game of, oh no, I'm sorry, it wasn't our fault or something, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about what makes you invest in certain companies. You must see a lot of pitches. So
yeah, you mentioned I have funded over 150 companies over 30 years, and while that may sound like a big number, divided by 30 years, it's only 4 or 5 companies a year, and I probably see a few hundred a month. So it's very, very, very hard for me to get over the hump of actually funding something, and it has to line up a certain way. So your question about what makes me fund something, I'd say it's really boils down to a couple things. There needs to be a very big market, and it has to be a market that's undergoing a transition where a new leader can emerge and win. Because stagnant big markets, really hard for a startup to get traction. But if there's some transitional thing happening where a new nimble player has an advantage over somebody defending legacy, it provides the opportunity to create a big company like a Zoom. I think second is management team. The people matter a lot, because in the end you're building teams. Companies in the end are teams of people addressing a problem, and at its core, you need a team around a great leader that has high integrity and that I could see myself working with for decades. Because, when you engage with a startup, at a minimum, it's a 10-year thing if it works. And if it really works, it could be many decades. So it's a lot like getting married. You really have to want to work with the person through ups and downs and hard times, as well as good ones, to really get involved. And then I'd say, lastly, it has to be, the kind of company that's capitalized right, or can be capitalized right, where a venture type of investment that isn't going to be billions and billions, but modest numbers, can really move the needle quickly on developing a product. Because venture capital is really tuned towards companies that very efficiently use capital to create big outcomes on not a lot of resources. Not like, starting a company to drill for oil all over the world, which would cost billions. That kind of thing will never work. So it's really markets, management, capital structure. And I think Zoom, first of all, it is a company that is doing so much good for this world. And on a sustainability note, I can't even count the amount of carbon that they have stopped from going into the atmosphere by allowing people to meet virtually like this and not having to get on an airplane. So I think it's a time saver, it's a carbon saver, it's just a far more efficient way for people to conduct commerce and or just meetings in general. And back to the framework of markets in the right time and transition with the right people. I had previously invested in some startups with Eric Yuan, the founder of Zoom. I had started a data science company of which I was founder and chairman, and Eric backed me. So he wrote a check to help me at the founding of what is Treasure Data that was acquired by SoftBank later. And in the discussions around why Treasure Data was a good startup for him to invest in around cloud and the transition that cloud would bring, he described to me a picture of how video conferencing might be changed by this transition from cloud. And if you're familiar with video conferencing at all, and you don't really need to be, but many of the older architectures like a WebEx or a GoToMeeting or Skype are client-based, not cloud-based. So you have to download a piece of software. And that little piece of software that's sitting in your machine, it has to do a lot of work. It has to use your CPU to grab the video and grab the presentations, if it can share it all, and then send them into the internet to reach the other people that you're talking to. So if you've got 25 people online, your little computer is acting as an engine to try to set up 25 different links and send all that stuff simultaneously through a skinny pipe. If you have the cloud, the end node takes whatever you're going to do and sticks it through your internet connection into the center, and then the center just replicates it and sends it everywhere. So it's a far more efficient architecture that allows many more resources to be applied to it. And given the differences in all the computers that any group of people might have, because somebody might be on a phone, you might be on a modern computer, I might be on a really old computer, in an architecture without that middleman of the cloud, if you take a bunch of different nodes and have them all meet in one place, the vendor, such as a WebEx, has to take the lowest quality link and make that the standard for everybody. Otherwise, somebody can't see something, right? So if you were on this call and there was somebody on a 20-year-old computer trying to see something, if you're sending high resolution, they can't see it. What good was it? So they would have had to bring your level down to the lowest common denominator. So the older single point architectures basically can guarantee you the worst quality of the largest group. Just not good. So Eric described to me exactly that. He said, wow, this cloud, somebody could build a really scalable back end and a front end that is a universal skin, and it'll just kill everything. And I was like, well, couldn't you do that? And he said, well, maybe I could. And 3 weeks later, he started Zoom, and I said, well, count me in. I'll write a check. And that was when Zoom got going.
Yeah, I like it because also he was in the team that helped build the WebEx team.
Yes.
Software interface. I thought was interesting too, because when I look for software that I'm going to use for work, I usually check, I go online, I check Crunchbase or pitch book, and I check, who are the founders to know,
Sure.
that company is going to have a standing leg in the next coming few years. So,
well, you may want to be an investor because that matters too.
I saw Eric Yan. Oh, he was with the team actually he built. So okay, it's a recommendation. And of course, I know you are one of the first investors. So, but of course, and again, is how they interact with customers, right away. How they dealt with the issues of privacy and so on.
Yes, he's established an amazing company culture. It's a very responsive culture, and they fix things right away.
Yeah, and it's ease of use as well, right? I think it's very intuitive. It's like it's very quick. You download it, it's there, right? I thought it was quite good for our.
Yeah, he's done, as you said, he's done some amazing things. One, they've built a company culture that is really about, it looks a little funny when you first see it, delivering happiness, because that was one of the mantras of the company early on. but he really is wired like that. He wants to make people not unhappy when they're using a product and happy when they're using it. So the company's always been about lowering the friction to use and not being complex, making it easy for anybody to get on. And I think along the way, he's established a company culture where the kind of people he hires are just happy people. They're good people with good intentions. And so I think it's a company that, because it's genetically like that, when they deliver a product, they've thought about the customer needs, they've thought about lowering the friction to usage, and they thought about, well, what can people do with this that is just great?
And what about the other companies you invested? Canva is one that is also a great, easy, fantastic software for graphic designers. Again, what drove you to invest in those companies?
You know, very, very similar thing. I think it was a transition in the market, cloud again. There was a proxy, just as there was a WebEx and many other video conferencing companies to say there is a big market here, and if you make it easier to use, people will use it. And the cloud makes it easier to use, more scalable and lower friction. The design business is the same thing. The year that I funded Canva, I'm guessing Adobe was probably worth about $32 billion in total market value as a company. And they were shipping well-known products for designers to create pages and to do graphics arts in a way that was really good at its time, but a little cumbersome, right? So you could order basically a big CD-ROM that had a gargantuan program on it that you got shipped to you in the mail in a box. And then you had to have a CD drive to upload it in your computer. Hopefully your hard drive was big enough, but you weren't sure. And then once it was loaded on, you would have a menu that had so many buttons and so many things on it that you needed to take a class. So you'd spend thousands of dollars on the software, and then you would spend thousands of dollars and weeks at a time taking classes to learn how to use it. And so Melanie, like Eric, wanted to lower the friction. She had used the old products in that space to create high school yearbooks and was teaching classes to other people on how to use Adobe, and just thought, wow, this is a lot harder than it needs to be. She could just simplify the process of design. And we're also in a world today where content is often reshareable. So if you think of way software is done with things like GitHub, where there are repositories online where a coder makes something and puts his work up and people can piece something together. I tell people now that software development was really development in the 70s. Now it's not really development, it's permission plagiarism. So you basically take other people's code and you piece together modules, and then you change variables and you iterate, and it becomes like building with Lego blocks. And so Canva, one of the great features of Canva is that there are a lot of people that have created a lot of prior designs that have put that stuff online. And if you own a restaurant and you want to make a new menu, you don't have to create it from scratch. You go find one that looks good and you change the color, change the picture, change the font a little bit, put in different words, and you're done. So they've really made people very, very, very productive on less time by leveraging other people's work, which is what a lot of the great companies do. So it's become a wonderful company.
And what's coming up in the next couple of months? You mentioned there are a few events you're organizing in partnership with the United Nations.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about it.
Yes, on October 6th, we're doing something with Lisa Kurbiel and the United Nations Joint SDG Fund. And then sometime in November, we're going to do one with JD Cruz around the UN Accelerator Labs. The one with the Joint SDG Fund is going to be a phenomenal session, because I think the UN has such reach and influence on so many economies, so many countries with so many economies. We're at a very interesting time in this world where, due to COVID and a bunch of other things, we've never had this level of income disparity in this modern era, where there's social tension and all kinds of issues societally that really need to be fixed, that I think have to be handled at a governmental level, not just by people, because people aren't organized well enough to fix it at a micro level. So the UN could have a very special role here in trying to tilt that. And if you think about the world, picture in your mind the globe and the number of people that are in developed economies and ones in undeveloped, relatively speaking, economies. You've got about 2 billion in developed, 5 billion in undeveloped. The part in the 2 billion is sitting on massive, massive debt. Actually, both parts are, but you've got a world GDP that is roughly 70 trillion. It actually shrank this year, so it might be closer to 50 because of COVID. But there's a debt level that's maybe 270 to 300. And so the GDP had been growing about 3% a year. The debt's been growing about 10% a year, right? So 3% of 2 trillion of GDP added every year, where there's maybe 10% of 300 trillion. So 30 trillion of debt on 2 trillion of new economy every year, every year, every year. Those lines don't intersect. So I think the only way to fix that and not get to a point where the world implodes on itself like it did going into World War I and II because of the issues of debt and all kinds of things then, is to get the other 5 billion people to start to step it up. If that part can grow and be onboarded, it starts to tilt that balance where maybe things are okay. And so the only way to do that is through economic development. And so I think we're in a world now, we're in the 4th industrial revolution. The 3rd was a physical industrial revolution, really around oil and machinery. Now we're around software and the ability to create massively scaling companies quickly, like a Zoom or a Canva, that can really start anywhere. I mean, Canva started in Perth, Australia, a little town of 1 million people on the far western corner of Australia. If you could create a global giant from there, why couldn't you create one in population centers in Africa that have 20 million people in their city? It's all very possible now. So I think what Lisa's doing and what we want to talk about on October 6th is how do we get the UN and its influential capabilities with countries all around the world to leverage what she's doing with the Joint SDG Fund as a way to create an incentive and the comfort level that the UN is involved in projects that are commercially viable everywhere in the world, not just in developed economies, and that provides a framework, a little bit of a touch point with governance where private investors can come in alongside with the UN and provide one part of that equation, the capital needed to help get these things off the ground. So I think it's a wonderful, wonderful effort. And then JD Cruz's effort in November is around the people element of it. Because it's markets, people, capital, and an environment that allows these companies to flourish. So Lisa's kind of addressing that part, the capital and the environment with the governments she worked with. And JD is at the micro level trying to create the environment and the fabric for entrepreneurs to flourish in that. So I think both of those are going to be fantastic things.
Yes, looking forward to it. So the event is open to the public. It's going to be web streamed or recorded?
They're both going to be webinars on Zoom.
Oh,
and I think there will definitely be access for the public at some point. I don't. The first one, the actual interactive dialogue with UN Joint SDG Fund, Lisa, David Rubenstein, myself, may be a closed discussion with some country leaders. But I think the interactive part may be not public, but the stream may be public. And then I think recordings of the content will definitely be public later.
Fantastic. So looking forward to it. A great pleasure speaking with you. Bill Tai, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with the UN Brief.
Thank you, Maya. Looking forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.